Inside with Tianwei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly has opened. Can China demonstrate its role in global governance by helping others tackle the UN-backed Sustainable Development Goals? Hollywood's Dunkirk and China's Wolf Warriors 2 have both stormed the Chinese box office. In our review, we're going to find out which movie best captures heroism, action, and tragedy to merit the audience worldwide. And we begin our program today in New York, where the United Nations General Assembly is underway. It is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations and the only one where all member states have equal representation. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China is determined to work with the UN member states to safeguard world peace and stability and promote development and prosperity.
Building a center role in global governance. The opening of the 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly was declared by its new president, Miroslav Lajčák, on Tuesday. Lajčák highlighted the importance of sustainable development goals and UN reform. He also spoke highly of China's effort in global governance.
I'm glad to see China playing a very important role, being a leader on a number of global issues, and I wish to see China continue playing this role and speak not only in its national capacity, but speak as a promoter of the UN agenda.
China stands ready to join the international community to actively promote the reform of the global governance system. Earlier on Monday, the 71st session of the UNGA adopted a resolution which incorporates the principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits advocated by China.
The resolution demonstrates that Chinese voices, proposals, and wisdom are gaining understanding, support, and response from an increasing number of countries and are becoming the consensus of the international community.
The principles that have been endorsed are also found in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN said all countries could benefit from them.
I think China has a leading role to play in the evolution of global economic governance for the future, not only because China is a very important global economic power, but also because China brings to the table its experience.
Next week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will attend the annual general debate of UNGA. Wang will elaborate on China's position and propositions on the international situation as well as major international and regional issues. As a founding member of the UN, China can contribute more to building a shared future for mankind.
For more discussion on the significance of this year's UN General Assembly and what is really behind it, in Beijing we have Mrs. Aji Veris, who is the country director of the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, here in China. Welcome to our program, ma'am. And also joining us in Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, our longtime friend, professor of National School of Development at Peking University. He's now doing a lot of research on South-South cooperation these days. And in Washington, D.C., in the U.S., we invited Cheng Li, the director and senior fellow at the John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, a well-respected scholar on China and the world. I want to have a big welcome to the three of you. We have a very strong panel today, but I want to begin the discussion with you, Ms. Veris. The significance of the United Nations these days have been very much debated. How relevant is it still? While you see some of the member countries are already refusing to pay their share of the fees.
Well, I think multilateralism and the United Nations as the largest multilateral organization is still very relevant today. Why? Because multilateralism is really about a joint dialogue of various nations to find common solutions and common approaches to common problems.
But multilateralism does not necessarily have to be all about UN. It could be about some other international organizations as well, Mrs. Veris.
That's right. But the United Nations is the one organization that essentially has 193 member states. And when we're looking at the world, which is faced with many, many global problems, from climate change to disasters, terrorism, and other conflict-related issues, we really need global solutions to these problems. And to have global solutions, including all the countries, we need a global governance mechanism, which the UN represents.
Mr. Li, you are based in Washington, D.C. You are aware of the thing going on there, which is President Trump, from the U.S. side, rather, is saying, well, really, the UN that important anymore? Is it still relevant? What do you think?
Well, certainly I disagree, but probably it's not really entirely correct to characterize Donald Trump in that way, because he actually paid attention to UN resolution regarding North Korea nuclear proliferation, and also that he sent a very important figure in his team to be the UN ambassador. So that speaks loud about his position on UN. Of course, as the largest country and the largest economy in the world, the superpower, the only superpower in today's world, that sometimes the U.S. may have its different approach, because some of the member states, the U.S. Assembly could be only have like several 100,000 people. So they have some different perspective. That's understandable, but I think that UN certainly, U.S. certainly should pay more attention to collaborate with UN, to work with UN, and I think the key word is governance. And there's no single word is more important than governance. Governance in domestic situation, in terms of clean government, civil society, and the governance in the world affairs, in terms of deal with common challenges, and also peace and security.
Mr. Lee, if I could just follow up a bit, Secretary General Guterres, he said very recently in the recent quote to the U.S. President, he said, you know, the ultimate American interest lies in a multilateral network like the United Nations. Do you think President Trump and his administration understand this?
Well, I think some of his team members certainly understand very well. I think Donald Trump also has a learning curve. Certainly before he became president, he said some things that the U.S. should have more on doing things by its own. And he is not paying so much attention to international organization, and also talk about the U.S. role in the NATO and many other multilateral communities. But certainly you can see the change over the past 6 or 7 months. He actually continued to remain in some of the international institutions, and even pay more attention to UN on the issue of the Korean Peninsula.
Interesting. We're going to come to you later about governance issue. Let's turn to you, Professor Fu, here in China. Of course, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been very upbeat about the role of the United Nations. Just think about how many days he spent at the UN meetings and conferences, and also meeting with the UN different officials and agencies as well. What is likely in China's mind in terms of UN's role, in China's overall blueprint for its own future?
Well, the United Nations will continue to have a big role to play, especially when we fight against a long list of global challenges. Having said that, there are gaps and holes in the system. If we understand why the UN has worked, it's because the UN keep a balance between idealism and the realism. And now we have to make an adjustment to the system because reality has moved ahead of idealism. By that I mean, if you look at the economic dimension of the global system, you see very dramatic shifts globally. And we need to make appropriate adjustment to the system. But of course, when you open up the UN system, you see different dimensions, right? The political dimension of the UN system, and there, even when you have lofty principles, when you say countries big or small are equals, but the operationalization of that is reflect the reality that big major countries are permanent members of the Security Council has veto powers. But imagine a system where every country has a veto power. Can that work? But then the economic dimension, you look at the IMF, World Bank, the voting are weighted according to the contribution. Then you have other agencies like UNESCO. Each country has one vote. So it's the combination of all these that make the system robust. I also need to add, there are gaps in the holes, and we should we have more to do to make that even more robust.
I think there are two different things, as you mentioned, Professor Fu. One is the ultimate structure of the United Nations and the idea of the United Nations, the ideal the United Nations has been holding since the founding days, whether that has been out of date. That is a very different nature compared to, let's just say, do some minor adjustment, let's just say bigger voices coming from the developing emerging economies, and also more UN Security Council reform. These are two very different issues. One is challenging the overall credibility of the UN system itself. The other is about how should we do to bear in mind. Having said that, though, the UN has been reforming and evolving over the decades since its founding. The UN General Assembly president recently said the UN reforms will now allow the world organization to work in a way it never has before. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also said he is totally committed to reforming the UN and making it more responsive to the needs of the 21st century, even though it sounds abstract. But, Ms. Veris, I'm sure you know when it's on the ground, it shouldn't be that abstract. And therefore, I want to ask you, United Nations Development Program is the head agency among all UN agencies when you are looking at one country. Usually it is the head of the UNDP that is helping to coordinate all the other agencies in one country. So I guess, in a way, you could better help us to understand that. What exactly is the role of your organization, let's just say, in China? How has that been different from previously? What exactly is the function of you now? Ms. Veris.
I think the key question is that the world has changed a lot. So since the setup of the UN and UNDP as a development organization, so we need to look at what is the world looking like today. So the role of UNDP as a development organization is very much advocating for development. And what this means is that we want an equal world where nobody is left behind. So the role of the UN and UNDP is not necessarily to do everything ourselves, but to be a facilitator, to be a convener that can leverage a lot of the resources and a lot of the capacities that are out there to address the development.
I heard an interesting word, facilitator. That's interesting because now you're suggesting you try to be a bridge rather than one going out there and do every project on your own. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because the shift in terms of the role of UNDP, for example, from an organization that has a lot of resources to offer to an organization that has the experience and the capacity to offer, and that
What kind of experiences? What kind of capacities? Are you using just the abstract word to impress us, or actually there are a lot of contents in it, Ms. Veris?
UNDP is present in 170 countries and territories, so that means we actually are very familiar with the context of these developing countries. We understand the development issues, and we compiled a lot of experience over the years how to address them. So through our network and the experience that we have, we can offer these solutions to other developers in innovation, and we can bring various partners together to address these together.
Belt and Road, is that one of those examples?
The Belt and Road is a good example in the sense that this is a more than one country's development issue, and while it's a vision for shared economic growth, this can be an accelerator to achieve global development.
And therefore, what is your role?
Our role in this, from a perspective of sitting in China for UNDP, is to try to bridge and try to link what China has to offer in terms of, for example, investments, connectivities, and what these developing countries need to address their development issues. So UNDP, as you said, the word facilitator and the word of bringing together the supply and demand, essentially trying to make sure that whatever investments and economic growth is there, it will generate development impact in these countries.
I've been to some of those conferences that you organize, UNDP in China organized, bringing all the other countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly here in Asia, from Myanmar, from Vietnam, from everywhere, coming together and talk about some of the possible plans and also public and private partnership in a way. Those are very interesting ideas. That's why I want to go back to you, Mr. Li. When it comes to international governance, there is reform about the UN system itself. There's also the reform about what is the proportion of responsibilities and also share in saying in the international organizations such as the United Nations. Let's just say China, developing economies, the emerging economies, vis-a-vis some of the developed ones. Mr. Li.
Well, of course, you have a good point. If you just single out the United States and China, these two countries actually they possess 40% for global GDP, and some of the tiny countries is so small. But I think the design of the United Nations has one is the Assembly, United Nations Assembly with all the member states. The other is the National Permanent Security Council, which has 5 major powers. So that explains the balanced approach. And on the one hand, you should pay attention to some major powers, but at the same time, the small countries' concerns should be heard. So that's a good design. Of course, the UN will continue to experience some reform in terms of budget, in terms of how to deal with possible corruption, and also that to make it more effective in some common goods, and whether it be environment protection, whether it be peacekeeping, especially in today's world, the refugee issue is so important. So I think in that regard that the UN will continue play a very, very important role. I think China and the United States are a major part of the UN, and we should not forget that the UN is located in the United States, and U.S. ambassador to UN usually later on move to be important position like a Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. That also tells U.S. actually, despite its own kind of major power sentiment or mentality, still think UN is important vehicle, and especially U.S. international relations scholars certainly value the importance of UN.
But Professor Fu, here's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, the United States rather, as Mr. Lee rightly pointed out, paid very much attention to the UN Security Council resolutions, particularly concerning DPRK. They want to get this consensus going on to show to North Korea. But at the same time, there has been a brush off of the significance of the other UN agencies. How do you see this apparent divide in a way in attitudes? Secondly, how is that compared to China? Is it going to be some competition between these two countries? Do you think the UN would love to see that? Ms. Berry already smiling at this point. Or you will see there's likely to be very different roles for China and the United States for the future in the framework of the United Nations. Professor Fu.
My observation of the United States is that the United States is both a republic and also an empire. Now, the difficult part of the global system is in the absence of a global government. Big powers have to come together to hold the system together. The United States has and will continue to play a very important role. Having said that, when we look at the role of China, China is a country that has moved from a country with economic performance measured by GDP per capita of a few $100 now to 8,000. Right. And when you think with the background, and China will merge as a country that will take more responsibilities to play. And the matter of fact is that it has already taken more responsibilities. Looking, if you're sort of thinking of the system as three dimensions, right. The physical dimension, institute dimension, and the dimension of ideas. China has been doing that in terms of the infrastructure, one belt, one road system, our contribution to the institute dimension, in the example of Asia Investment Bank, and my organization, the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development. It's a platform for the exchange of ideas. What about
bigger say? If you have bigger responsibilities, obviously you're expecting bigger say, I guess. Is that true for China too? Direct answer, please.
Yes.
Do not be diplomatic, Professor Fu. Go ahead, direct answer.
If we are making positive contributions, we should have a big voice in the institution that we are part of.
All right. Having said that, though, how to have a bigger voice? What kind of bigger voice? Bigger voice for whom? That comes to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I guess I still have a souvenir coming from the UN, the little China panda over here. That is supposed to be the Sustainable Development Goal panda. Ms. Varys, this, of course, is just a soft stuff, the toy. But this is also an effort coming from the UN to try to persuade every country that they have a role in the Sustainable Development Goal. 2030, that's the year we are talking about. How far are we coming from drawing up the real blueprint? We can talk all the time, but where is the plan, Ms. Barris?
Well, it's a bit early to tell how far we came.
Still early?
We're 2 years into the plan, and the reason I'm saying it's early because the main step is that 193 countries are actually agreed on something, which is not that common. So that is a great achievement. So in that sense, I think we already took a big step forward. But in terms of monitoring and measuring the results, it's a very complex picture because while this agreement is there, it has 17 goals with hundreds of indicators behind it. So to see the progress from a baseline to something we want to achieve will take some time.
You guys have already drawn up a very complicated system in order to make it work. But Mr. Li, is there going to be competition about countries within the UN framework when it comes to whether to achieve sustainable development goals? We understand governments have views on some of the questions, climate change and the security situation for the future, poverty issue as well. Mr. Li.
Well, absolutely, because different countries have different agenda, different priorities, despite the fact that there's also shared interests and the shared emphasis. So we should not forget that at the time when the U.S. soft power is declining, you can imagine that China become more and more important. But at the same time, we should also make sure that China's growing influence will take some time, because China's commitment for foreign aid for refugees, for peacekeeping, although increased significantly over the past few years, but compared with some other countries, is still quite limited. And of course, China is very popular among Latin America, in African countries, but a lot of other countries, including China's neighboring country and maybe Western country, for a right reason or wrong reason, has still a lot of concern. So what we call the Chinese 话语权, the voice, should be heard, but this should be based on China's positive contribution. I think in that regard, we see the development. We welcome China's growing influence, but at the same time, China probably needs to take more responsibility. And at the same time, you see a lot of movements. Some countries want to join, become the permanent UN Security Council, and some countries really emphasize on the UN reform. So these are naturally, there's some different interests and conflict views.
When you think about almost 200 countries together, having some consensus, that is mind-boggling to me. But before we go, final words from you, Professor Fu, as well.
Well, I buy the concept of a common and a shared responsibility. That is a reflection of different stages of development of each country. In the case of China, our GDP as an aggregate amount is number 2, but in terms of GDP per capita, it's a little bit over 8,000. We still have a long way to go.
A long way to go, but for now, the panda should be working for the Sustainable Development Goal. I'll let you bring it back home.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Aji Veris, Fu Jun, and Zheng Li. Really appreciated all of you for being with us. Thank you. And you are watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program. Hollywood's Dunkirk and China's Wolf Warriors 2 have both stormed the Chinese box office. We will critique these blockbusters to find out which movie comes out on top, and more than that, what does it say about our understanding of heroism in history? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. After Wolf Warrior 2 stormed the Chinese box office, another film, Dunkirk, gave it a run for their money. Dunkirk was produced by Christopher Nolan, one of the world's most well-known directors. Both films explore heroism. However, Wolf Warriors 2 depicts a complete victory, while period piece Dunkirk shows a successful retreat. Survival instinct, depression, at desperado, and tragedy. Do these movies capture these life or death moments? And do they bring to life the struggles of heroes and heroism in wars? To talk about that, we have a very strong panel with us here in Beijing. We have Professor Teng Jimeng, our regular cultural affairs commentator, certainly a very seasoned film critic here in China. And also we are joined by a younger colleague, Ms. Zhang Xiaoxiao, senior journalist, at NetEase, who's a film critic as well. Peter Xiao, CEO of Orb Media Group and Immortal Studios. Welcome to you, sir. Let me begin by asking you, is it worthwhile to compare the box office of these two movies in order to demonstrate whether they're of the same quality or one is better than the other? Professor Teng, very briefly.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think these two films are not comparable at all. I mean, in this case, genre-wise or thematic concern.
Specifically, what do you mean?
Well, in terms of the themes concerned, I think the Wolf Warrior 2 is all about a rising China. It's all about this triumphant success, come to the rescue of the African brothers and sisters, whereas Dunkirk is a shameful defeat which covered up the history, the shameful history of Britain, two imperialist countries fighting without eventually that success. Totally missed the opportunity to win the success.
Well, when you say shameful, that's really an interesting word. Mr. Xiao, do you agree with those descriptions portrayed by Professor?
No,
well,
not exactly.
Mr. Xiao, please. Sorry.
I'll leave the commentary to the academics, but for those of us in the entertainment industry, they're pretty different movies. For one is actually based on historical events. The other film is a fantasy movie, which is a great action set. So they're really apples and oranges. So I don't think they invite this kind of comparison, though it is entertaining to talk about it.
And the one who is talking about the apples and oranges already nodding his head with Professor Teng here. I know you just want to be provocative at the very beginning.
Yes.
Let's go to Ms. Zhang here. What do you make of it?
I don't think, I would say on the contrary, I think it's very interesting to compare those two films because both of them, this theme of them are coming home, and maybe they have different emphasize parts. But I think it's interesting, but not comparing the box office, but the aesthetic value. It's interesting to compare those.
If you say it's interesting, let's do some comparison because it has a lot to do, some say, with people's understanding about what is making of heroes and what heroism is in different cultures. Peter, you know, Dunkirk, it was a retreat story. In Chinese history, there was also a lot of retreat stories.
Right.
For example, the Long March. It was about several times of retreat just to maintain your capabilities and eventually fight back. So what do you think about Chinese culture of accepting a retreat story? How do you see people's Chinese audience apparent enthusiasm also about this retreat story? Peter.
Well, first of all, I don't think that the box office performance of Dunkirk in China is because this is a movie about retreat. I think it's actually a very sophisticated movie that doesn't have a very direct character that you can relate to. You could say that is about one general, but it could be about the soldier on the ground. Actually, it's about many, many different characters caught up in the historic plot. So in as much as in the aggregate, it is about retreat, but I don't think the film goer is saying, oh, I don't like this film because it's about retreating. So I personally think that the Chinese marketplace, and as with the global marketplace, people have a portfolio of different tastes. Now, I think it would be a mistake to say that Chinese people think this way and not this way just because, from this example, those of us who struggle in the trenches of the entertainment industry every day creating these heroes, my sense is that people like different heroes and different heroes are appropriate at different times.
Right. Very interesting thought that Peter is arguing it is not about retreat or success. It is about whether it is a masses that we are seeing in the movie, for example, Dunkirk, or like a one individual hero, like you are seeing in Wolf Warriors 2. And you know what, Professor Teng, and you know, the mass story usually has been the focus of Chinese movies. But the individual success story usually is the focus of a Hollywood blockbuster. And this time, it's the other way around. And it seems both are doing great. How should we understand it now?
Well, first, let me just take Peter's question on the Chinese audience not liking retreat. I think retreat, historically and in terms of our values, is a very, very shameful word. It's almost a taboo. I mean, the Chinese national government retreat from Nanjing to Chongqing during the 1930s, it was such a shameful, and nobody would talk about that part of the history. The Long March is a different story. The Long March is all about a strategic retreat, but then had a final goal to fight the Japanese, to fight an aggressing, an invading
and Dunkirk
army.
Is not.
And Dunkirk is not. Dunkirk is totally kind of missing the opportunity. Remember that very story about the history, the real history about these Anglo-French soldiers hiding in trenches.
So what is your point? The Chinese audience like retreat or not like retreat?
No, they
or
don't.
it only happened one movie?
Absolutely no. It's a very dark, it's a very gory, it's a very ghoulish film. I think ultimately it's because this director used a very different dictatorial technique. For example, there's 3 narrative strands, there's mixed editing and the gory,
I really hope we could have some of the videos of the movies being played around at this time so that to show our audience. But exactly what do you say about that masses vis-a-vis one individual of heroes, so-called?
Right, and with Wolf Warrior 2, it's almost like a rip-off from a Hollywood production. This time around,
with Chinese faces, though. With Chinese faces, though.
With Chinese faces, though. But then it's total. The whole thing, production value, production-wise, is a Hollywood blockbuster film.
So you are saying, Professor, that it has been a great success that you just put a Chinese face over a story of Hollywood script.
Yeah, and you use one script, one character, and one story narrative strand. Do not complicate it, do not confuse our audience.
The 2 gentlemen are saying their own versions. What about you, Ms. Zhao, from your perspective?
I agree with Mr. Xiao more. I think it's not about what the story is. It's not about retreat or success. It's more about how you present it. How can you create the character that can hook you up through all the films? I think in that sense, Wolf Warrior 2 has better quality in terms comparing with Dunkirk.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm not sure whether better quality is exactly what you meant, but let's go to Peter. I couldn't wait to respond, Peter.
Well, look, I want to go back to the theme of retreating again. I saw Dunkirk, and as a member of the audience, I thought the movie was about saving something that you really cared for. It wasn't really about retreating. And Wolf Warrior was really about heroism. Look, when you reach the kind of success that Wolf Warrior has reached, close to 6 billion RMB, we're talking about a phenomenal experience that Dunkirk has not reached. So clearly, Wolf Warrior is saying something about the mentality of a lot of Chinese filmgoers and Chinese citizens who want to see themselves, their culture, our life expressed in a very positive way, an empowering way. So those sentiments are exactly on the money, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for other types of heroism.
It's not about money this time, Peter. I disagree. I disagree with you profoundly. I think it's all about different zeitgeist. Let me use that German word. It's different time spirit of the time. It's all about a rising China, economically, politically, and perhaps militarily. I mean, you see that back in the past, this country has been burdened with the history of humiliation and being humiliated in that film. And so
all right. I got it. You got different arguments, but you know what, gentlemen? You have ignored one fundamental factor in all of this. I have to say it loud and clear. Ms. Zhang, you know what I'm talking about when you go to those movie premieres as a journalist. That is, they are being shown at a very different time frame. The Wolf Warrior was being shown to the public during the summer vacation when the kids are in the theaters watching movies, all of them. And yet, Dunkirk, of course, is after that only, and it's being shown in China for a much shorter period of time. So, are we ignoring some of the most important factors, Ms. Zhang?
Of course, I think you have to take elements into account when you talk about the box office success. I think it's pretty sure that the Wolf Warrior did stir up some emotions. Other than that, I think the exact timing is very important.
And that has a lot to do with, you know, what to do with international blockbusters, Hollywood blockbuster, Peter, and what to do with so-called the Chinese homemade movies, because the latter has been pretty much being treasured and also cultivated in China over the years. Peter, so what do you make of that?
I'm sorry, if you could speak to it again.
Yeah, the question is, it has a lot to do with whether there has been emphasis being put on homemade movies, such as Wolf Warrior 2. And yet for Dunkirk, international ones, there are times in which they will be shown. There are times in which they will not be shown to the public. So, Peter,
the blackout dates. But
yes.
keep in mind the weekend that Wolf Warrior 2 opened, it was the founding of the Republic Army, which was
the Chinese PLA, not the Republican Army.
A mainstream government film was also showcased, and the people clearly chose Wolf Warrior 2. So this brand of action-packed patriotism was preferred.
Okay, there's a big correction over there,
so they
Professor.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about the founding of the Republican Army, but it's the founding of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army.
Right.
People's Liberation Army. Okay, having said that, though, you know, for a movie to succeed here in the Chinese market, what elements would it have? Probably it would be able to, in a way, help to support patriotism and help to support what you said, Professor Tang, that many people have in mind that there has been a rising pride in China about both its future and also about its own people. And thirdly, it has to be something related to a very well-designed Hollywood structure. And fourthly, you probably need to have one individual as a hero. Are these four important elements what makes a great movie?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, all these four elements actually contribute
I didn't want to put words into your mouth,
the
Professor.
making of this great movie. And I mean, first thing first is the production value. And I see Wolf Warrior almost as a co-production because with the technology transfer, you can see the music side of the talents are from Hollywood, the photography and also the script writing are also very, in a sense, the direction actor are very much Hollywood. And also the production value, it is almost the best in terms of professionalism from the PRC since the beginning of the 21st century. Lastly, I think Wu Jing is now an emerging star, a second-generation action star. I mean, he is almost classmates to Jet Li at Beijing Martial Arts School. And so this is the second generation of martial artists who rose with the emergence of China as a new power. And in this case, the rise of patriotism and also nationalism.
Okay, well, you know what? Not only that, there seems to be a lot of movie analysis and critiques going on in the media, in the APP and stuff. But there has been a lot of negative stories of Dunkirk, let's just say, before it was shown, and very pro stories about the Wolf Warriors too. And if you look at some of the general story. But you know what, Ms. Zhang, since you're a journalist writing movie critiques, there has been questions about how credible art critique, including movie critique these days in China. Because we understand journalists need to survive and they take maybe red envelope, some say, but others say it's not fair that you're portraying journalists like that way. So to what way people can rely on movie critics like you, and to what way people can relate it to the kinds of scores you give to the Chinese movies and also to the international blockbusters?
I would say Chinese audience, they have their own judgment. On the one hand, I have to defend on that, not because I'm a journalist. It's also because it's a part of promotion. It's not just in Chinese film industry. It's in American industries as well. Another thing I have to say is, to be fair, the Chinese critics also give a lot of high comments, highly valued Dunkirk, the production value of Dunkirk.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is a misunderstanding that some of earlier comments that I mentioned, right? Is that what you're saying?
Partly, yeah.
Okay, great. Peter, so the Chinese audience having all of these diversity of choices when it comes to movies, how to make the choice, what to rely on to make the choice, and who would help them to understand better about the qualities of the movies. We're not saying teach them, but help them to cultivate a better sense of the qualities of movies. Peter, what is your suggestion?
Well, look, I'm a Chinese kid who grew up in Hollywood, and I worked in Hollywood for many years before moving to China to implement some of the things that I learned in Hollywood, particularly the craft. So I think the Chinese audience, in my view, are looking to connect with meaningful stories that's just not hollow, that speaks to something authentic and real, on top of the production value considerations. So I think for the past several years, there's been a lot of hot money flowing through China, so there's really been more of a financial really focusing on the quality of the stories. And I think the success of Wolf Warrior is an example of Hollywood technology really taking root and fueling Chinese storytelling. And I think that is a new trend, and it's a very promising trend. So those who don't really up their game in terms of storytelling don't really stand a chance in this marketplace. So I think it's a very positive development. Now, having said that, if I could answer that simple question, I would be a billionaire.
Well, I'm sure you're on your way to answer that question.
Working on it.
Working on it. Before we go, final words from you. Is it the time for the real good quality movies from China to shine?
I think yes, but then even with that said, I think that the learning curve is still very, very deep. But with all these policies in place, with all these talents in China, I think that we are really on the right track to produce more valuable, more production, blockbuster kind of a value blockbuster films.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to have all of you back on our program. Teng Jimeng, Peter Xiao, and Zhang Xiaoxiao. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And let's have fun in the movie
Good to
theaters.
be part of it.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Have a great night.